Hey guys, quite a few of you here already. Stephanie, good to see you. Jody, Margaret Zabinski. Sorry, I'm a little bit out of breath. Try to make it on time, but I was 1 minute late. Zircon, good to see you. Joan White says, looking forward to this. SM Kovalinsky, good to see you as well. Yvette Kelly, you as well. So, in case you're wondering what this image is right over here, it is. What do you think it is? Let's see if anyone. Let's see if anyone can guess what that is. Anyone? Any ideas what that is? Anyone been doing some research? What do you guys think that is? First of all, what do you think this big thing is? What do you guys say? Thinking. Come on, guys. What do you think this is? Margaret Zabinski says table. That's a good guess. And so, what is this on the table? Jody says stained pillowcase. Well, it's a stained something. Did any of you guys see the movie Elvis? Because that should give you a clue. Any further guesses? Cindy, aka Skinny, greetings from Triple Digit Heat in Austin, Texas. Corin Sanderson, good to see you from Wisconsin. Sharon Tuck says autographed chair. No. Ricardo, that's a really good guess. Ricardo says it's a contract on a napkin. Well, it is a contract. There's the contract. And if you watch the movie, it did depict a contract on a napkin, but in reality, it was a contract written on the tablecloth of a table in a coffee shop. That is actually what it is. And this contract actually stipulates that Elvis will earn $1 million a year for 5 years, so altogether 5 million, and he will be paid $1 million for 8 weeks of performances. So basically, for 8 weeks of work, he'll get $1 million. Sharon says, I haven't seen the movie yet. Okay. So Sharon, when you do see the movie, think about this. And just bear in mind that the contract wasn't actually written in the audience while the show was going on. That is depicted quite dramatically, but it was actually, I think, done immediately after the first show in a coffee shop in the casino, on the tablecloth, and there it is. I just thought I would start off with something kind of interesting like that. So we're going to begin with, this is really a deep dive into the kernel. We're going to begin with a, what can I call it? An interview that he does, and then we're going to go into his backstory, right? I'm just feeling a little bit like I need to be careful. I would love to play you excerpts from the interview, but you've got to be careful doing that on YouTube. So I'm not sure how much I am going to play. I would love to play it for you so that you can hear, but you've got to be careful, to stay within YouTube's guidelines. Sharon says, seeing it tomorrow. Okay. So before we get started, I want to read this really awesome comment from someone on Patreon. Her name's Nisi. Well, that's her avatar. And she watched the video that we're going to be talking about now, right? And this was her reaction. This was her reaction. She said, where is it now? She said, "Boy, watching this video saddens me so. The proud, beaming father and almost childlike," so there's his father, "an almost childlike, insecure Elvis, and the ringmaster, the puppet master, Parker, off stage." That's actually Parker's shadow there. There, you can actually see him. There's his shadow on the curtain. But there are other shots of, it's not really, there are other shots where you can't actually see him, but you can see his shadow, right? In a way, I've kind of spoiled what I'm trying to depict here, because for a lot of the video, you don't actually see him. You just see the shadow. But anyway, so Parker's off stage. There is Elvis's father. There is Elvis. Obviously, the quality is a little bit better when you actually watch the video. But Nisi writes, "I'm no professional by any means, but Elvis seems pretty sober in this video. He's attentive, his cognition does not seem impaired, he's pretty quick on his feet. Looking at him through our eyes," and this was in 1972, "fully aware of his drug use, we might expect a very different scene. I can't help seeing him as a dog that has been hit time after time. He flinches and cowers, almost standing up from his chair to regain power and control. When he speaks of visiting other countries, my heart broke. To think he was the king of rock and roll, all of his hard work, fortune, and fame, yet he was never able to fulfill that dream. I definitely believe, in my opinion, as has been alluded to, this is due to Parker's sick reasons of not getting caught for his horrible deeds. But Elvis was his own man in the end. I believe he needed to take accountability for his own misdeeds. Although Parker had the one up over Elvis and his propensity to drugs and women, it just saddens me, though, that another human being, Parker, saw that, took advantage with the sickest of methods, and ultimately knew that he could gain so much control over another. Back to the cowering of a dog. I think of breeders of fighting dogs, or with Parker, the abuse of elephants back in the day for the circus. He says, "Parker, as seen in this video and others, looks like he's in control of an animal for his gain and purposes. His look, actions, mannerisms. It's quite disgusting and disturbing. I wish his father could have stopped the crazy train," meaning Elvis's father. "But Elvis was his own man. In my opinion, he completely enjoyed the fame, drugs, women, and song until he was so far gone for countless reasons that he didn't want to admit that self-destruction was his only way out." There's so much to Elvis's story, good and bad. Watching not only what he lived through, but also how many lives he touched, good and bad, is a lot to digest. I think my saddest takeaway from this video was, in just a few short years, he would be gone from this earth. A sad cautionary tale. And what really gets me angry more than sad is Parker was a despicable, destructive psychopath that managed to live a long life. Indeed, he lived, I think, to 87, more than twice as old as Elvis. I believe in karma, and I'm hoping somehow he was affected by it. Then Nisi signs off. This is all her comments. She says, "Thanks for your coverage on this subject, Nick. Amazing work as usual. I was 9 years old when Elvis died, and I clearly remember crying my eyes out. My childhood diary even has a page dedicated to it. Funny, I know it's due to my mother and grandmother's sadness because I don't really remember Elvis at that age. He was quite the talent, that's for sure." So I just thought that was a great comment. I hope Nisi doesn't mind me reading it. It would be great, Nisi, if you can find that diary page where you remember Elvis in your 9-year-old handwriting. So if you can find it for us, that would be quite special, I think. So I have been quite stressed about presenting this particular episode, just because how do I present it without playing this video? Now, I could do it the easy way and just provide you guys with the link and then not play anything. But I don't want to do that, and that's where the stress comes into it. So what I might do is just play the audio. I might do that. So let's get going. Let's just have a look at some of your comments. Ms. Justice says he wanted to be a serious actor. Well, that actually comes through in this video. It actually does come through. Okay, so this episode is essentially a deep dive into who the Colonel really is. We're going to follow this up tomorrow with the timeline, a very detailed timeline of the hours leading up to Elvis's death, and then the next episode dealing with his autopsy, which is really surprising and kind of grotesque, and it makes one quite uncomfortable. So anyway, this is the deep dive into who the Colonel really is, and there are at least two ways to skin a cat. There are two ways to sort of go into this at least. And so the first is to try to get actual video footage, not of Tom Hanks in the movie Elvis, but the Colonel, in other words, the real McCoy. And we get that by going to the June 9th, 1972 New York press conference where Elvis, his father, and the Salty Colonel are all present. Now, if you guys are really obsessively into Elvis and you can find better material, better interviews on the Colonel, by all means. But what makes this particular clip useful is that we get a strong sense not only of how the Colonel behaves, but how Elvis responds to him. So in other words, not just an interview with a Colonel, you actually get a feeling for the dynamic that's going on between them, and that's really important. The second way to peel away the layers, bear in mind, this Colonel has tried very hard to hide his past away. So second way to uncover what has been buried, what has been purposefully hidden, is, to really get to know this guy, is to investigate the Anna van den Enden affair. And we're in luck because a Dutch journalist has already done that for us. And we'll sort of look at what he spoke about towards the end of this episode. Although the Colonel looks like a dead ringer for a homicide committed in his hometown of Breda, committed on the same day he left the Netherlands for good, we kind of want to still look closer at the circumstances surrounding the case. Do the clues and the evidence consistently point toward the Colonel, aka Dries van Kuik, or do alternative suspects and or explanations come to the fore? What do you guys think? Anyway, let's start with New York in 1972, the press conference, right? That's where we're going to start. Shall we go back to that? Okay. Just wondering how I'm going to do this. If I'm going to only play the sound. If I'm only going to play the sound, then I'm going to have to turn the sound up. So let me do that. Okay, hopefully that's turned up enough, right? And okay, so at 16:19 in the clip provided, and I'm going to provide a link for you guys so that you guys can listen to the whole clip if you like. By the way, if you're listening to the replay of this and you can't find the clip, then just let me know in the comments and I'll put it there for you. But anyway, there is the clip. But we're going to break it into about 4 or 5 segments where certain specific things are said and the reactions to that. Okay. Okay, so this was 1972. So at 16:19 in the clip provided, first the Colonel's voice can be heard, and then you can see him. Elvis, who is standing in the footage, also turns to look at the Colonel, who is gesturing and shouting behind him. The Colonel flaps his hand at some photographers at this moment here, coming across quite brusque and rude. He also repeatedly interrupts Elvis. So I'm not going to show you the actual footage, but I'm going to play you the actual audio. Are you guys ready? Here we go.
I don't know. That's a good question. Why is that, Colonel? He said, why did they send the concert in Boston? They didn't come here.
That is 8:20, 8:23. I think that's actually the wrong clip. Anyway, at that particular clip, a female reporter asked Elvis a question, and the question is basically, why haven't you filmed Elvis performing here in New York? And when Elvis is unable to answer the question, it might have sounded a bit muffled to you. He sort of scratches his chin and then he refers it to the Colonel. And this interaction speaks volumes. The question is basically, why haven't you performed in New York? Why haven't we been able to film you in New York? And so he then defers to the Colonel, and whatever the Colonel says, Elvis doesn't seem to understand, either doesn't understand what he's saying or he doesn't agree with it. And so Elvis simply shrugs good-heartedly. You kind of get the feeling that speaks volumes of their relationship, that the Colonel calls the shots, the Colonel is in control, and Elvis sort of good-heartedly and good-naturedly sort of goes along with it. He sort of feels like he's in good hands, and he doesn't question it. And although he's not necessarily very happy with it, he ends up sort of going along with it. Not quite sure why the 16:9. Maybe if I go to 16:19, I can bring that up. Just a second. It's quite important that I play this particular part. So this is where the Colonel actually interrupts him. Elvis is actually standing up, and the Colonel sort of interrupts him quite a few times. See if you can make out the audio.
No, on social comments like that, I understand how to make it.
So many people that had all these things, you might step aside and let you try to
Can you hear him saying, step aside, please step aside?
Come on up if you can. Come on, let's get inside the place. Come on, step aside. All of you, all right. Come on, bring your cameras over here.
Still interrupting him.
The bell was an award from
Still interrupting him.
the bell was an award from the International for the.
So what was actually happening there was Elvis was standing up to try and show his belt. He's like wearing a gold belt under his suit. And the Colonel then gets up and asks the photographers that haven't gotten close enough to Elvis to come forward. And Elvis is actually standing trying to talk to the media. And meanwhile, the Colonel is having a separate conversation and kind of interrupting Elvis quite a few times, just to say, photographers, come forward, make sure you get your photos, right? You just feel that tension a little bit in the atmosphere. So overall, one has the impression that Elvis is warm and affable, but that the Colonel is neither of these things. It's also noteworthy that although the Colonel speaks here, he speaks here and there, he remains off center stage throughout. You'll notice if you watch the whole thing, you don't see the Colonel almost all the time. And then you sort of wonder, why wouldn't he be seated right next to Elvis and his father, rather than shouting things from off stage? Also, right at the beginning of this clip, you have some strange character, not the Colonel, who introduces Elvis's father, and then I think Elvis as well. And you sort of wonder, why isn't the Colonel introduced? Or why doesn't the Colonel introduce the father? And you kind of get the feeling he doesn't want to be on camera, like, you know, in the terms of a press conference. So this is the part where it gets really interesting. At 6:28, a journalist asked Elvis why he's been in seclusion for so long. And that is definitely something that comes up in the film. This idea that he's being isolated, he's being controlled, he's being manipulated in kind of a sinister way, right? So a journalist in New York in 1972 is literally asking him, Elvis, why have you been in seclusion? And Elvis sort of blames the movie contracts. He says, you know, being contractually obligated to, but in a way that is touching on the contracts that the Colonel has sort of, what's the word? So he's sort of in a bind that he can't escape, and the Colonel has bound him to these contracts, which effectively control him and control what he can do. Anyway, so what's really interesting with this is at 6:28, he's asked about, you know, why he's been in seclusion, and the issue of his performing overseas comes up. And what's quite interesting here is it seems like Elvis has finished answering the question, and another journalist, I think, starts to ask another question. Elvis actually stops him because he feels like, I want to address this question in more detail. I want to spend more time on the question. So he sort of politely interrupts. He also apologizes, and he says, there's so many places I haven't been yet. He says, I've never played in New York. I've never been to Britain either. Then at 7:03, he's asked point blank, would you like to, Elvis? In other words, would you like to play in other places? And Elvis nods and he says, I'd like to. Yes, sir. I'd like to very much. I'd like to go to Europe. I'd like to go to Japan and all those places. And then he sort of wipes his eye and he says, I've never been out of this country except in the service. That's in 1972, right? That's in 1972. So despite feeling this way in 1972, and despite expressing it, you know, 5 more years, and about five more years and a month would go by, and that wouldn't change. So for the next 5 years, he also wouldn't travel. And guess who was responsible for that? The part that's interesting is Elvis is saying this right in front of the Colonel. And so you kind of get the sense that the Colonel hasn't said to Elvis, you are not going overseas under any circumstances. The Colonel feels that, thinks that, but doesn't express that. In other words, he manipulates Elvis. He doesn't say to Elvis directly, you will never perform overseas, but he just sort of pulls the strings in a way. I'm just saying that here he is at a press conference expressing what he wants to do, and the Colonel is right there. Do you think the Colonel cares? Do you think the Colonel's going to do what Elvis wants or what he wants, right? I just think that's a really interesting point, is that Elvis is there right in front of the Colonel. And let me bring myself a little bit back here. And so the Colonel is obviously completely aware of how Elvis feels about it. He's also aware he hears the media asking about it, right? Scott Rayburn says Tom Hanks is playing that dude. He's right on. Hanks is evil as hell too. Terry Dean says the Colonel didn't want to go overseas because he was an illegal immigrant. Yep, that is the case. So although Elvis is quite assertive here, he seems quite assertive here when he's asked his opinion of women's lips. So, for example, he seems quite assertive of, yes, I would like to go overseas. I would like to go to Japan. I would like to go to Britain. I would like to go to Europe. He says, when he's asked his opinion on women's lib or on serving in the military during the Vietnam War, Elvis seems very cowed. He seems like he's not going to give his opinion. And although he doesn't look at the colonel when these questions are asked, one does have a sense that he's deferring to the colonel not to express his opinion on anything that might stoke controversy, anything that might alienate a fraction of his audience. Obviously, in a sense, that wouldn't be good for the colonel either. Now, right at the beginning of the press conference at 2:37, a reporter asks Elvis, why has it taken so long to perform in New York City? At this exact moment, the colonel shouts off camera something about the photographers waiting, right? So what I'm trying to communicate here is just how clever he is that in the middle of this press conference, someone has asked something that really has a bearing on him. You know, why has it taken you so long to perform in New York City, right? And so you could almost imagine Elvis saying, well, it's the colonel. Well, the colonel has decided this or the colonel has decided that. And before Elvis can answer, the colonel starts shouting at cameramen, and you sort of wonder, was that deliberate, right? He's shouting at off camera about the photographers waiting until later to take their pictures, and it's something that he then shouts about later on as well. Anyway, when Elvis says he thinks they had to wait to get the building, so Elvis's answer to the question, you know, why did it take you so long to perform in New York City? He says he's not sure, but he thinks they had to wait to get the building, meaning Madison Square Garden. Then a journalist asks with incredulity, in 15 years, you couldn't get a good building? And Elvis then repeats those words and laughs. Again, is quite good-natured, but it's as if he agrees that the answer makes no sense. And once again, your feeling goes back to the colonel. The colonel has decided he's not going to perform in certain places, right? So I'm going to play you the audio there, if I can find it. It's at 2:37.
Okay. I think it was a matter of not getting the building, the proper building. We had to wait our turn in order to get the building. Couldn't get a good building in 15 years.
So I'm not sure if you caught that while Elvis is talking once again, the colonel is sort of off camera shouting things. So it's kind of creating a noise and a distraction. And they end off sort of dismissing the question as a joke. The reporter says, Jeepers, in 15 years you couldn't get the building. And Elvis says, yeah, well, in 15 years we couldn't get the building. And it's a pity that this joke wasn't taken a bit more seriously. Just have a look at some of your comments. Tommy says, I had a velvet Elvis, which I miss, and an Elvis headshot latch hook rug that I made myself. Scott Rabin says, my grandma made us dress up to see the concert in Hawaii on satellite, and it was the best. Yeah, that's also quite an interesting interview he gives on that when he talks about, I think it was broadcast, was it in 36 countries or 38 countries? But Elvis himself said he thought that was an extraordinary moment. But can you imagine if Elvis himself actually had gone overseas? I mean, the king of rock and roll, like the king of rock and roll sort of worldwide, never going overseas. I mean, imagine if the Beatles never went overseas. Imagine if the Beatles never went to America. Ms. Justice says, do you think Elvis didn't fire him because he had things against him? It's an interesting point. I think that's a part of it. I also think Elvis did try to fire him. That's documented. And then the colonel gave him a big bill that Elvis couldn't pay. So it was obviously in the colonel's, what's the word? It was to the colonel's benefit if Elvis spent all the money that he had as he earned it. And that's another way that the colonel manipulated Elvis, was he kind of said, you can't take cash with you in a coffin. You need to spend your money as you make it. And so Elvis took that to heart, and he did. He was, you could say he was very generous, or you could say he was somewhat reckless with his money. You could also say he possibly should have been more careful about how his career was being managed. But I think there's a point where he was aware of that, and he felt like he couldn't do much about it. You've got to admit that the contract where he got paid $1 million per year for 5 years, this contract that the colonel organized, you've got to admit that that's a pretty damn good deal. If you think about it, $1 million a year for 8 weeks worth of work. You can also imagine in a scenario like that if you only work really effectively for 8 weeks and you've got so much money, aren't you going to be tempted into bad habits, eating into excess? You're a sex symbol. Just imagine it in a very simple way. You're a sex symbol. Everyone wants to sleep with you. You work very hard for, let's say, 8 weeks, and the rest of the time you can kind of go to Hawaii, go to the beach, be in your mansion, watch movies, hang out with Miss Tennessee, whatever. And aren't you going to end up getting into some bad habits with all of that leisure time on your hands, kind of thing? Beverly Lawyer says, I've been to Graceland and watched the first Hawaii concert on national television. Yeah, I mean, he certainly, what's the word, had an impact on the world, right? Chris Rowland said, I can't hear the audio very well. Well, that's fine. I won't play anymore. You can maybe try and listen to it on your own if you can find it. Okay, so now we're going to just go on to just a question. How did Elvis and the Colonel get along? And when you watch this video, when you study it, you get the sense that the Colonel seemed to be a prickly and unlikable fellow, but he was a very good negotiator. He was good at getting deals and that sort of thing. And bear in mind, Elvis was his only client. But if they didn't get along, and especially as the years went by, now it's 1975. This interview was conducted in 1972. You've got to wonder, like in 1975, that, by the way, is Elvis's cook. And that's the house that he bought for his cook. And he also bought, I think, even more than one car. I think he bought 2 or 3 vehicles for his chef. But this is 1972, and you've got to wonder, 1973, 1974, 1975, how well did Elvis and the Colonel get along? And then if they didn't get along, how was the Colonel, this prickly, unlikable guy, able to keep Elvis under his control? And that brings us to circus tricks. Now we're going to start going into his background. Parker's background was as a carny, someone who excels at conning and trickery. That's his craft. In a real sense, a carny is tricking an entire audience, manipulating a mass of people. So if he was doing that, why wouldn't he do that to his numero uno client? And as it turns out, when the Colonel wanted to exert more control over Elvis, he either got rid of certain people close to Elvis, or he strengthened certain relationships. For example, it was the Colonel's idea, get this, it was the Colonel's idea that Elvis get married. He could then use Priscilla as a sort of lever to keep the king in check. I just want to see if I can find some of those pictures I've got of Priscilla. Here's a good one. Let's just put that up. Maybe just make it a bit bigger. Yeah, okay, that's right. Okay. Another way of manipulating Elvis was by encouraging him to spend his money as fast as it was coming in. That alone kept Elvis relatively dependent on the Colonel for bringing the money in. As I said, Elvis bought homes and cars for many of his staff, including his cook, Mary Jenkins. And that is a picture of her. I showed it to you earlier. Well, why is it not coming up? That's a picture of Mary Jenkins. Okay. So where did Parker learn his tradecraft? Where did he learn to be such a wheeler and dealer, right? Where did this come from? Well, think about the sheer amount of manipulating required for Parker just to keep his past hidden. If you just think about that aspect, he's just trying to keep his past hidden, but constantly and from everybody. Just doing that is going to teach him how to be a master manipulator as a matter of course, isn't it? Besides that, he needed to manipulate things, so sort of systems, you could say, so that his actual residency, his legal domicile, was never exposed. Think about how taxes may have played havoc with the colonel's status. That's just one element, especially if Elvis went overseas and, importantly, earned money overseas. So now I'm going to refer to this really good article. It's from the Smithsonian. Don't know why that's there. Can I get rid of that? It's from the Smithsonian. Really, really good article. And there's a quote from the magazine. Quote, Parker had taken such enormous care to keep his past hidden, why he had settled a lawsuit with Elvis's record company when it became clear he would have to face cross-examination under oath, and why, far from resorting to the sort of tax avoidance schemes that managers of big music stars typically offer to their clients, he always just sort of let the IRS calculate his taxes. Now, if you think about it, this guy's quite a greedy guy, and yet he's not greedy when it comes to his taxes. Why? Well, because he's still trying to protect his identity. So the lack of a passport, this is going back to the Smithsonian, the lack of a passport might even explain the single greatest mystery of Presley's career. Why the colonel had turned down dozens of offers totaling millions of dollars. I think that should actually be tens of millions of dollars. We know just from Saudi Arabia, he was offered $10 million, to have his most famous client tour the world. According to the Smithsonian, quote, Elvis was just as famous in London, Berlin, and Tokyo. Yet in a career of almost 30 years, he played a total of only 3 concerts on foreign soil, all of them in Canada in 1957. And border crossing formalities in that time were minimal. So even then, the colonel did not accompany him. So this is really quite interesting, is that you might ask, when did the information actually come out? When did it actually become available? When was it actually known? What is going on with the colonel? The true story about the colonel, when did that actually come through? Well, would you believe that 12 years before this interview, 12 years before this interview in 1972, where was I? I think I want to go there. 12 years before that interview, that's when it actually came out. So according to the Smithsonian, although it took years for the story to leak out, it actually was solved as early as the spring of 1960. Just shows you how sometimes information is out there, but it takes a while for the world to catch on, right? So the mystery of the colonel's origins was actually solved as early as 1960. So 12 years before this interview and 17 years, it would take 17 more years for the truth to come out. In other words, just after Elvis's death, right? And I do think once Elvis died, the colonel's domicile became important because of him, to some extent, inheriting and taking over the business. In any event, how do you think it came out that, how do you think somebody found out who the colonel was? Let's start there. How do you guys think the reality, that first little spark, how do you think that started? Do you think it started in America? If so, with whom? And or do you think it started in the Netherlands? If so, how? Autopsy, no. Jones said it was said that Elvis had a fear of flying. Yeah, that is totally false. I mean, he had an aeroplane. He was flying to Hawaii all the time. Louis says, where were the mafia based? Well, I think it was Memphis. But I mean, they were like a friendly mafia. It's not the mafia, I think, the way you're thinking of it. Rita Book, thanks very much. Wow, thanks a lot for that. Rita says, hurts my heart. Yeah, I think that a lot of people's hearts are broken. Rita, do you have a question or a comment besides that? You're welcome if you do. Terry's got a really interesting question. Was it through the military? No. I think this is going to really tickle a lot of you. The actual way that this came about. Beverly Lawyer, yeah, that's so true. Those words, caught in a trap, can't walk out because I love you too much, baby. Yeah. Okay, so I'll give it to you in little pieces. First of all, it was a woman who found out who the colonel was or what was going on. So that's the first point. Number two, it was a woman in a hairdressing salon. So it was a lady in a hairdressing salon who was having her hair done that figured this out, right? That's the second point. The third point was that it was the colonel's sister, that was the colonel's sister in a hair salon in the Netherlands. She was having her hair done. While she was having her hair done, she opened a magazine and she saw a picture of Elvis and she saw, hey, I know that guy. That's my brother. And so that's actually how it happened. Yeah, his sister. And so that was what he was afraid of. He was afraid when he appeared in certain contexts that he would be seen. And obviously, in the 50s, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have television, you didn't have what do you call it, social media, or you didn't have things the way they are now. People were also not moving around quite as much as they are today. It wasn't such a globalized society. So how it happened was his sister went into a hairdresser in the Netherlands, opened up a magazine, and a journalist had happened to snap a picture with the colonel in it. And so she figured it out. And then the question is, what happened after that, right? By the way, so this happened in the spring of 1960 in a hairdresser salon in the Dutch town of Eindhoven. Now, I believe my family used to be in another Dutch village called Enkhuizen. Unfortunately, it's not the same one. Anyway, so this woman, her name is Nell Donkers van Cake. She was flicking through a copy of Rosita, a Belgian women's magazine, and this had a story about Presley's discharge from the US Army, right? So it was right at the beginning of his career, essentially. And it was at that moment that the colonel was seizing control again. And she could actually have changed the entire story. If she'd kind of put her hand up and kind of contacted the tabloids or something, the colonel could have been kind of swept away. She saw this picture of Elvis standing in the doorway of a train waving to his fans, and then she noticed a large figure grinning just behind Elvis, and this made this lady, Nell Donkers van Cake, jump. And this person that she was seeing, he'd gotten a lot older. He was a lot fatter than she remembered, but she still recognized him. Oh, that's my long lost brother. And we get that information in this article from the Smithsonian. So this was exactly what the colonel feared. He was worried about someone either finding out who he was or someone who knew who he was recognizing him. As I say, in the 60s and 70s, the world was a much bigger place than it is today. You could remain relatively obscure just by staying in the same place, which is why he wanted. Remember, it wasn't just about the colonel not moving around. It was also that Elvis must not move around. If Elvis moved around, the colonel had to move around. If the colonel didn't want to move around, he needed Elvis to stay put, right? That's why it's so unfortunate. That's why it's so tragic. That's why it's so sort of frustrating. That's why it's so sad. So yeah, you could remain relatively obscure just by staying in the same place. Today's globalized society, airlines, the internet, social media, and the media has changed all that. But then the colonel figured if he just kept a low profile, he might as well be invisible. And you might think that he wasn't keeping a low profile here, but he kind of was. If you watch the video, he's always sort of off stage. He's wearing a hat half over his face. If you pay attention, he's sort of the hat is maybe not there, but the hat is sort of half covering his face, and he's in a room where he's the only guy wearing a hat, right? So so you still got to ask, who was he? Who was this guy, right? So the answer is Parker was born in Breda in the southern Netherlands in June 1909. He was the seventh child of a delivery driver and his wife, so pretty humble beginnings. His real name was Andreas Cornelis van Cake, or Dries van Cake, and he changed that to Tom Parker because that was the name of the military officer who interviewed him when he signed up for the army. So according to the article in the Smithsonian, let's just bring it back up. This article, see if we can, that's actually the town of Breda, right? The colonel was able to suppress all of these unwelcome details about himself, right? Quoting from the article, when his overjoyed family sent a brother to the States to see him. So his sister recognizes him in the magazine and breathlessly tells her family, and they like, oh my God, you know, our brother is managing Elvis. Can you believe it? And so one of her siblings then decides, I'm going to go and find him in America. It's obviously the colonel's worst nightmare. And guess what happens? And again, you must think about this person, this personality, the psychology of this person, the psychology of the person that left the Netherlands, didn't even tell his family what was going on. What circumstances were taking place that made him do that? What circumstances made him break contact with his family? They had to have been quite serious. Also, what kind of person could treat Elvis like that, the way that Elvis was treated? What were the reasons behind that? And of course, remember what we said about how he was at Elvis's funeral, that he was inappropriate, that he was not emotional, that he didn't reach out, that he first went to, I think, New York to cancel concerts or something. And so his brother said, wow, when I saw Dries, he was very cool towards me, and he seemed very worried. He seemed worried that me and mom and the rest of us would be after the money. So that was his response. He was quite cool, quite standoffish, and are you here for money? Now, you'd think that the colonel would be happy to see his family. You'd think that it would be maybe a little bit of a strange reunion, but nevertheless, wow, it's really nice to see you. Instead, we once again see signs of a psychopath who cares more about money than family. Is that clear? Somebody who cares more about money than family. And if he cared more about money than family, how little did he care about his client? So returning to this article in the Smithsonian, when his brother returned to Breda, and by the way, this image is from Breda. The crime is supposed to have been committed there in this, where this car is, right in front of it. That was where Anna van den Enden was murdered. In that building, which is a grocer's store. And so this was also quite strange when the colonel's brother returned home. He didn't really say anything to his family. The Smithsonian describes it quite well. They say, quote, he remained perplexingly silent on Dress's new life. You know, they wanted to know all the details. You know, where is he staying? What's going on? What is he doing? And his brother arrives back, and he doesn't really want to say anything. Sinister, isn't it? So you kind of get the feeling that the colonel somehow got his hooks into his own brother, and somehow got his brother to remain silent. So this is the part that's really crazy, and I've put this part as a question in the poll. That according to his biographer, Elena Nash, the brother didn't say anything. He didn't really say that he was doing anything, except that Dress had painted sparrows yellow and sold them as canaries. And that's the first thing. That's the first thing. And I've got to say, on the one hand, it sounds like a tall tale. It sounds like, really. On the other hand, in a weird way, it makes you think, didn't he do that with Elvis? He painted Elvis yellow in a way. I'm just saying he sort of created a cartoon character of Elvis, the rings. You might say, oh, I love Elvis. But in a way, he reduced Elvis to kind of a cartoon character, an attraction, and he sort of stuck him in one place, right? In a cage. I mean, what do you do with a canary or with a sparrow? Well, not with a sparrow, but a lot of what was going on was a lie. You know, if you think about the whole idea of a canary is supposed to sing, but it's actually a sparrow. Well, in this case, he was actually turning, in a way, a canary into a sparrow. Do you guys agree with that? He was turning this vibrant, talented man, well, he was reducing him to this sort of caged role because of his own flaws, right? Yeah, canaries sing too. Stephanie says, no regard for others. Yeah. Yeah, what a con. I mean, you've got to think that this is some piece of work, somebody who paints sparrows and sells them as canaries. That is, you know, that is not too many people would do that, but this guy did. Then Alana Nash, the guy who wrote his biography, also said that some members of his family, of the colonel's family, suspected that the colonel had paid the brother not to talk, right? And it makes you wonder, was that how the colonel exerted control over people in general? Did he pay other people to, if they were upset, did he pay them off? I saw a video just today where apparently Elvis had become friends with a waiter at the hotel where he was performing. I think the guy's name was Mario, and Mario and him kind of became friends. And Mario told him that his mother had cancer. And because Elvis was a very generous guy, so the story goes, I'm not sure if it was the colonel or the manager of the hotel felt that the waiter was sort of manipulating Elvis, and so he wanted he wanted the waiter fired. When Elvis heard about this, he actually spoke about it during his show, and he said, I'm worried about my friend. I'm worried that he's not going to have a job. And then he sort of, I think he even mentioned the hotel manager by name, right? But you kind of get the feeling that certain people are controlled with money to not interfere, to not talk about certain things, right? Money is making kind of the world go round. Elvis is doing his thing, but a lot of money is corrupting what should have been something that was even better than it was, right? So if you think about it, if the colonel feared that his family were after money, perhaps he managed to ward them off by paying just the one sibling who came over to keep his trap shut. Now we're going to go to another website. It's called Mike History. And yeah, we get a little bit of deeper background on the colonel. And we can go a lot deeper. We could spend a lot of time on this. I'm actually not going to be on. I'm probably going to be on for 90 minutes, if that. This is going to be a kind of a shorter show than usual. We can spend a lot more time going deeper, but in terms of Mike History, it says here, quote, details of Van Cuyp's childhood in Breda eventually emerged a few years later, but only in its Elvis time, a small circulation Dutch fan magazine. From there, they were picked up in the late 1970s by Elvis biographer Albert Goldman. By the way, I actually looked at Albert Goldman's book on Elvis. I've actually just ordered it on Amazon. A lot of the reviews say Albert Goldman's very biased. He doesn't like Elvis. He disapproves or whatever. But why I bought the book was it describes the last 24 hours in particular of Elvis's life. That's what I'm interested in. And it's from the late 1970s. You can't ever do better. Often when you come to a story very late, like the John Benet Ramsey case, it's very, very hard to generate the authentic vibe of the time. But if you go to the people who wrote the news stories of that time and you look at the video footage, that's when you get the best idea. But looking at what, let's say, someone like Paula Woodward is saying about that case today, I don't know whether it's a very derivative. I'm just saying some of your best narratives come about when something's actually happening. And I try to do that with my true crime writing. I think the books I wrote on the Oscar Pistorius trial really captured that, and also Henry van Breda. By the way, I got a letter from a Canadian psychologist today saying that what I wrote in those books on Henry van Breda are, sorry, I'm blowing my trumpet here a little bit, are quoted in a peer-reviewed study. The point is that this guy, Albert Goldman, was Elvis's biographer. And I've ordered that book, and that's probably going to provide a lot of interesting detail. A lot of the reviews say that he doesn't sing Elvis's praises. Others say it's a very authentic narrative. So we'll see what it says. It does say here, as late as 1982, the idea that Park had not been born in America was little more than a rumor in America, right? So think about this 22 years after the fact. The idea that Parker is an imposter is basically just a little rumor. And just think about this idea of fake news today and our information is distorted. This was fake news in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And look how damaging it was, right? And look at how fake news comes about. Someone in an obscure country says something and no one listens. Someone writes a book, no one pays any attention. Years go by. Eventually Elvis dies. And then only after his death, when it's too late, does it start to catch on. And that is how slow the world can be in figuring out what is really going on. I hope that is a sort of cautionary tale that you should pay attention. that what everyone thinks isn't necessarily the truth. Terry Dean says, that's why I said 1981. I knew I got that date from somewhere. Okay. So going back to the site Mike-History, it says, quote, the colonel's exposure as an illegal immigrant makes it easy to understand his deep reluctance to leave the States, or even, as he once confided to a trusted assistant, to pick up the check he had earned while working his passage from the Netherlands, end quote. Now, you get the idea that the colonel thought of his nefarious behavior as justified, meaning he was entitled to it. He was working very hard because of the circumstances he was in, so he was due a big paycheck. But you can see how narcissistic that is. He's just thinking about himself. It doesn't matter how much Elvis suffers. It doesn't matter how much Elvis doesn't, Elvis is like a worldwide phenomenon. So you must know somebody controlling Elvis because of their own situation is, in a way, unfathomably selfish. It's, kind of crazy. So he kind of felt like he was entitled to all the money he was making because of his unusually difficult circumstances that he had to overcome. So very much a greedy person thinking of himself. And you get that impression as well in that video clip where he interrupts Elvis, where he is really just focusing on what he wants, even within that interview. And so once again, this feels like particularly psychopathic psychology. Even in terms of himself, he sees the only way to make up for anything is money. So here's another quote from Mike-History. Quote, his apparent unwillingness to solve what should have been a minor problem does remain a puzzle, end quote. That is such a fantastic quote. It's such a fantastic observation, because you might say, this is the flip side, is if he didn't commit murder, right? If he had simply gone to America illegally, by the time he was, by the 1940s, bear in mind he went to America in 1929, but like 11 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, the colonel was gaining in power and influence because of Elvis, because of his relationship with Elvis. And for someone who could wheel and deal to the extent that he could, why couldn't he wheel and deal in terms of his own passport issue, which, if you think about it, it's a minor problem. I mean, there's another way to become a legal citizen. You become naturalized. Also, you can marry somebody, right? And he did marry someone. So why was he so unwilling to solve a minor problem, right? And that's why I say this is kind of a deeper dive, because this is a very deep but smart question that is raised. Let me just put it up here. Sharon Tuck says Elvis performed at Madison Square Gardens in New York. Yeah, but the question was why not before 1972? And also, I think why wasn't that filmed? Nisi, good to see you here. Nisi, I don't know if you saw, we read out your comment and everybody loved it. So thanks a lot for that. Yeah, Terry Dean says, what else was he hiding? So to go back to the article, it says the Alien Registration Act of 1940, this is in America. Again, you might say, what's this got to do with true crime? Well, a lot. The Alien Registration Act of 1940 offered amnesty to all illegals, right? And so this was the colonel's opportunity to put up his hand and say, okay, I'm going to register and I'm going to make myself legal. And yet he doesn't take advantage of that. And that is in 1940. What I think is so great about this article is it says when Elvis made it big, his manager made plenty of powerful new friends. Quote, by the 1960s, Parker could have placed a phone call directly to President Lyndon Johnson to smooth out any problems with his naturalization. That's not an exaggeration. Elvis was huge. So Parker could literally have just called the president and said, can you help me? I've got this little issue. And I'm sure the president would have said, Colonel, no problem, right? So why didn't Parker? And the answer is because he has got a very dark side that he's hiding. And if he's hiding a very dark side, then that is why there's this darkness overshadowing Elvis, right? And you've got to wonder to what extent Elvis was pushed and controlled and all these other things taking place that shouldn't have taken place. So I do think that's an excellent point. The colonel's immigration or passport status didn't have to be a sword of Damocles over his head. So why was it? It's a rhetorical question, but don't you think the answers now become abundantly obvious? He did have the option to sort out his whole situation, so why didn't he? Once Elvis died in 1977 at age 42, only after that happened, only after Elvis had died, did some of the gory details start coming out about the colonel's past. And the curious thing is also that all of this happened in the Netherlands, right? The unpleasant details came out in the Netherlands first, and then it took quite a long time for it to sort of filter through to America. Now, at the risk of alienating some of you guys, I see a lot of that taking place with the Depp versus Heard trial, where you get certain stories coming out in the UK and even other countries, but America doesn't cover it, right? And then you think in America you're getting the truth, or you're getting the truth that's better. But think about Elvis and think, are you really getting the truth? Or are you getting the truth that somebody's decided that they want you to know so they can make more money, kind of thing, right? Karma says Tom Hanks did well. You would enjoy it. My grandpa had a Dutch accent, and all I could hear was a Dutch accent with a southern over it. You guys must try and watch the movie if you haven't seen it yet. I think I'm going to do that. Okay. Sunflower says Elvis's career fell into the wrong hands. Okay, so this is the part that's really interesting. So it was actually a Dutch journalist in Breda, Parker's hometown, a guy called Dirk Willinga, Vellenga, and he got a tip. This was a guy who was sort of following his story anyway, but this Dutch journalist got a tip, and the tip was quite simple. Do you know that Tom Parker comes from Breda, right? And the tip went on to say his father was a stableman for Gent and Lewis on the Vlassak, and so began apparently a 30-year search for the truth about the colonel. Now just think about that. 30 years. It took 30 years to basically figure out who this guy was, right? And it really all started with this Dutch journalist, Vellenga, and I think Alana Nash, just thanks to her, I think she contacted this Dutch journalist. It's almost like, how can one put it? I think a good analogy for how the story came to America is a little bit like, but bear in mind this is a Dutch backstory, and a kind of a dark backstory. How does it come to America? in a similar way to the Van Gogh story, Van Gogh's letters are published by his brother's widow, and then those letters are later read by somebody who writes a book, Lust for Life. Wasn't it Irvine Stone, Lust for Life? Yeah, Irving Stone writes Lust for Life. It's based on Van Gogh's letters and paintings. The book is made into a movie, and so America gets to know Van Gogh, and that's how the story. In other words, it's got to at some point transition from Europe and Dutch to America, and that only happens in a sort of gradual process. Somewhere along the line, you've got to have a person who's bilingual who is able to read the one thing, and so it gets translated, if that makes sense, right? So in a weird way, the same thing happens here. An American author goes and really makes contact with a Dutch journalist, the way I understand it. And what she finds out that Dries had been a family storyteller. So up until he was, what's the word, 20 years old or 19 years old, he would sort of spin yarns. He would be a bit of a performer in terms of his family. And so didn't he go on to do that? If you think about a marketer, marketing people, advertising people, promoters, they're all in a way storytellers. I was actually listening to, I'm not going to say who it is, but I was listening to a podcast with two people talking about Brian Laundrie, and everything that was being said, I knew. It wasn't news to me, but I thought it's just because it was communicated quite well, it sounded very professional and very expert, but none of that information was new. And so being a good storyteller can be a big advantage. My sense of, I don't know about you guys, my sense of this guy is that he's not very charming, is that he's not very likable, but you kind of get the sense that he has some strong ideas and that he's quite pushy and determined, and that's where he gets his way. The other thing is he dresses a certain way, and his dress code and all of that all plays into his power game, I guess. So anyway, as a young kid, the Colonel was a family storyteller, and he dressed as a dandy. He liked to dress up in a certain way. And you can see he's still got a bit of that. And he obviously dressed Elvis up in a very big way. But his investigation took a much more sinister turn after he received a second tip in 1980. So this is quoting from, I just want to make sure where I am quoting this from. I think it's from the Smithsonian. Yeah. This is from the Smithsonian mag. Sort of going quite far down now. Anyway, this is from the Smithsonian mag. I'll put a link in the description. I mean in the chat. Rita Book says Liberace was Elvis's mentor for his costumes. Really? Stephanie says he's literally in character. Yeah, like a pushy salesman. Okay, so this is quoting from the Smithsonian. Quote, Valenca had been filing occasional updates on the Parker story. The Colonel was by far the most famous son of Breda, that's this town in the Netherlands. And he found that he was building a detailed picture of what was by any standard a hasty departure. So in other words, this journalist figured out by putting all these little pieces together that this guy bugged out of town very, very quickly, in super quick time, lickety split, he was gone, right? He didn't like leave hastily. It was like very, very quick, and he was just gone, right? Um, he basically vanished in May 1929. He didn't tell any of his family. He didn't tell any of his friends. He didn't even take his identity papers with. Now, who doesn't do that, right? In other words, he doesn't want to be identified. He doesn't want anything that's going to identify him. He doesn't take any money with him. He doesn't even take the expensive clothing that he's spent a lot of his money on. So he spent a lot of money on his clothes. He doesn't even take that with. So can you see it's become of paramount importance that nobody recognizes him, that there's no way of tracing him to where he's going. I'm talking about on his physical person. He doesn't take any of his identity with him. He doesn't tell anyone, takes no money. The money could even identify him as well, I suppose. Or maybe from the crime scene, he went straight to the docks. Who knows? It feels like he didn't even go home to get anything to pack. He just went straight to the nearest ship. And so this is quoting from the Smithsonian, what Alana Nash says. She says, this means he set out in a foreign country, literally penniless. And that's huge. That means that he was really desperate. And you can imagine that that was quite a nightmare situation. You can imagine he's hungry. You can imagine his first meals he's got to steal. You can imagine what he does to survive in those first fraught days. Unlike Caitlin Armstrong, he didn't sell his Jeep for $12,000. He is heading overseas with nothing, right? One aspect that I disagree a little bit with is we don't know whether, let's say he did kill Anna van den Enden. Well, if he did kill her, did he not steal something from her, jewelry or money? If he did, well, then he could have used that. And wasn't that the point of why he did that? Then it goes on to say, quote, in the late 1970s, Valenga ended one of his newspaper features by posing what seemed to him a reasonable question. And he said, did something serious happen before Parker left that summer in 1929 or maybe in the 1930s when he broke all contact with his family? At least one of his readers thought that question deserved an answer, and a short while later, an anonymous letter was delivered to Valenga's paper. And I think we can go down. Anyway, it reads, gentlemen, are you guys sure you want to hear this? So it's like an anonymous tip, and it says, gentlemen, at last I want to say what was told to me 19 years ago about this Colonel Parker. My mother-in-law said to me, if anything comes to light about this Parker, tell them that his name is Van Cake and that he murdered the wife of a greengrocer on the Bochstraat. This murder has never been solved, but look it up and you will discover that he, on that very night, left for America and adopted a different name. And that is why it is so mysterious. That's why it is not one to be known. And I've got to say, it all fits. It does all fit. And isn't that really sad that you know, on the one hand you can say this man made Elvis. It's just unfortunate that he, in a way, also unmade him. You know, if couldn't it just have been someone else, an American maybe? So that's my story. I hope you found it interesting. It is a bit of a deeper dive. But to me, it just sticks out, this anonymous tip, and also this idea of a guy painting sparrows yellow to make them look like canaries. And one wonders whether he didn't do that very early on when he arrived in America. You know, maybe that's how he made his living right in the beginning. And maybe he was really good at fleecing people, and he was so good at it, it was a lifestyle. That's why he thought of himself as the snowman. Terry Dean says, I'd like to see what the Colonel's obituary said. John Hammer says, many, many in our world walk free among us all. Yeah. So in a way, that is the price that was paid. I don't want to blame anyone, but I just want to say that is the price that was paid for a kind of a failure of critical thinking. Here's this oddball, and strange things are happening with Elvis, and no one really bothers to figure out who this guy is, and everyone is the poorer for it. And you know, everyone's tempted to go along with the party, and then look how they end. Look how tragically they end, right? Sharon has provided, looks like the obituary. Should we have a look at that? Sharon has provided, looks like the obituary. Okay, so if I look at the poll, true or false, Elvis's manager painted sparrows yellow and then sold them as canaries. 84% of you say true. 84% of you are 100% right. Well done. Okay, so shall we go through his obituary? Colonel Tom Parker dies at 87. Colonel Tom Parker, and it's funny that this is, when is this published? It's funny that there's not a date here. Why is there not a date? Anyway, it's funny that they don't really give his real name, because that's not his real name. Anyway, Colonel Tom Parker, 87, a one-time carnival pitchman who shrewdly guided singer-actor Elvis Presley's career for 22 years, died here, January 21st, after a stroke. He became Presley's manager in 1955, just as the young Memphis truck driver was breaking onto the national scene as a rock and roll sensation. Colonel Parker stayed in the position until the King of Rock and Roll died August 16, 1977. Colonel Parker is credited with getting Presley a $35,000 recording contract with RCA Victor in the mid-1950s. He also arranged early television appearances, including 3 on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and 1957. But you kind of got to wonder, why didn't he appear on other talk shows later on? Then it starts turning into sort of a negative slant. He seemed to exercise firm control over Presley, who affectionately called Parker Admiral. But there you have it. He seemed to exercise firm control over Presley. Talks about Parker taking 25% of Elvis's total income at times, 50% at other times. Percentages that some thought was too high. Now you can imagine if some people thought it was too high, he might just pay them off and get rid of them. Says here, he defended the profits he made, saying, I sleep very good at night. When they've done all they can with him, then they start picking on me. I think do you remember Casey Anthony also said something like that? I sleep very good at night, or sleep very well at night. Then it refers to the court narrative here. After Presley died, it says here of a diseased heart. I'm not sure that's accurate. There's some people who say it's an overdose. Some who say it's a heart attack. Some say broken heart. Some say other things. We're going to look at the autopsy. Anyway, the courts ruled that Colonel Parker had no legal rights or interest to the Presley estate. In 1983, he had to sell an undisclosed number of master Presley recordings to RCA for $2 million. The sale was a result of a series of lawsuits against him, accusing him of taking advantage of Elvis Presley. One of those suits was filed by his daughter, Lisa Marie. In August 1987, he held a rare news conference on the 10th anniversary of Presley's death. He became defensive when he was asked if those around Presley might have saved him by getting help for his drug problem. Colonel Parker snapped, "We're here to honor his memory. I think I didn't hear you very well. Thank you." So there you have him showing he has the temerity to snap at a reporter when it's just asked, couldn't you maybe have helped him? And then he actually gets angry. Then they talk about just him being very mercenary, that there was no surprise that that news conference had a promotional tie-in. The public was charged $5 to see photos and placards. I think it may have been Lisa Marie Presley made some comment that she was surprised. I think it was at his funeral, at the funeral of the colonel. She said something like she's surprised that there wasn't a charge to go to his funeral. And I think that, in a way, says it all, that the Presleys got along with him, they tolerated him, and they were very well aware of how money-grubbing he was, but they thought maybe that it was a necessary evil, not realizing just the extent of that evil. Does that make sense? What's also interesting here is they talk about him turning down a lot of book offers, some worth 7 figures, and that also doesn't make any sense in a normal respect, where you'd say, wow, this client of yours, Elvis Presley, has made history, is a historic figure, and you don't want a book about that. That's a great opportunity to make money as well. No, I'm not interested. Why not? And then he twists it into, oh, you want the dirt on that, and I'm not going to get, no, well, you can just tell the story, right? He says, I'm not a dirt farmer, but he can obviously just tell the story, and he elects not to. And I must say, I think in a weird way, he was a dirt farmer. I think in the sense that he got his hands dirty. He was working in the shadows, if that makes sense. Goes on to say Parker was 300 pounds, enjoyed smoking Cuban cigars, and was said to be lacking in social graces. Well, in that clip of him at the Madison Square Gardens in New York in 1972, he definitely seems rude and obnoxious and insensitive. It also mentions here that he wore a baseball cap to Elvis's funeral. It's quite interesting that they say he used a cane much of his adult life because of spine problems. I wonder whether he didn't actually use that cane, have that cane with him in case he needed to defend himself against someone, as a weapon. I just wonder. It also says here he enjoyed gambling and was seen playing roulette and craps in Las Vegas, where he lived since the 80s. At the end of the day, this guy was a gambler. That's really his identity in a nutshell. The life that he was living in America, the entire thing that he was doing was a kind of a gamble, and in a way it paid off. In the early 1940s, he was a dog catcher in Tampa, Florida. Now, if you think about it, do you remember that at the crime scene in Breda in the Netherlands, he sprinkled black pepper or pepper because he was particularly conscious of dogs. And so the dogs come up quite often in his narrative. That's just a funny little thing that repeats itself that seems to confirm something, doesn't it? And anyway, that is it. I hope you guys have found this, like a crowbar. I hope you guys have found this an extension on the first analysis. It is 4 a.m. in South Africa. I'm going to be at a physio in 7 hours, so maybe I can get a little bit of sleep before then. Louise says maybe wanted to be near Las Vegas all the time to gamble. I think so. I think that is right. if you watch the movie, gambling was a big thing, and he ended up being quite, as happens a lot, in quite a lot of debt because of that. Stephanie says, brilliant, Nick, loving this. Was sad when I thought it wasn't happening. Okay, well, that's good to hear. Okay, so tomorrow I'm going to be continuing with the timeline of Elvis's last day, and I found it fascinating. I was really surprised. I was like, in a weird way, I was like, reminds me a bit of me in certain respects. I mean, I'm about to go to sleep now at 4 a.m. Elvis as well. Elvis would go to sleep when everyone else is waking up, and he would struggle. And then that's where the problem comes in. And you've got to wonder, why was Elvis overstimulated? You know, we have social media. What is overstimulating him? Well, I think there was to some extent television, but there was also, he was Elvis. The world was his oyster in a way. He could do whatever he wanted to do, and so why would you want to sleep, right? Onesie says, "Thank you, Nick, and all. Fascinating." Okay. Are there any more comments or questions? Anything else you guys want me to attend to? Beverly Lawyer says, thank you very much. Nisi, thanks a lot for your comment. Really enjoyed reading that. Remember to try and find that diary entry of yours. Yeah, I definitely have a problem with sleep. It's sometimes better, sometimes worse. Yeah. Yeah, so Terry, we're going to be looking at the timeline, and then we're going to, after that, look at the autopsy. There are also quite a few interviews with his sort of lovers, mistresses, also his wife, and those are also really, really interesting. It's just quite difficult to, I'd love to play them, but it's, you know, I don't really have permission to do that. So it's quite difficult to do that. If you guys, obviously the people on Patreon get that advantage. You can see what I'm talking about, and then we flesh it out. So if you're interested in that, make sure you do join Patreon. It's patreon.com/TCRS. Stephanie says, very enjoyable, much appreciated. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for making it, and I'll see you guys next time.